really get purified, right? Because we don't have this idea that it even exists. So one of the places that is full of drip are these kind of public places. Public schools are notorious, hospitals, airports. Maybe you notice when you go into these places you feel kind of dull, right? Or maybe you get a headache. There's something about there's just something about the energy. I don't like being there, right? This is a real phenomenon. It's called drip. Places are full of drip. And I believe that the Native Americans, when they're smudging, they knew about this, and this is why they're burning this sage, because it purifies, it clears that kind of drip. Okay, but we don't have this idea of this practice. We don't smudge the public schools. We don't smudge the hospitals, right?
I did it recently. Not a public school, but a school I was going to.
Yeah.
After Trump was elected, there are a lot of people who had negative thought forms.
Yeah.
And the school was having a lot of troubles for days. And then the owner called me in and said, "You do smudging?" I go, "Yeah."
Yeah, exactly.
So we had to go in and clean the negative energy out because it was spiraling on itself. And people kept getting more negative energy, and it was just getting bigger and bigger.
We are very affected by that, whether we're aware of it or not.
Under the tables, it's just...
Yeah, it's everywhere. We breathe it in. We are affected by this kind of drip. So therefore, when you go to like monasteries or dharma centers, before a lama arrives, they always do a big song. Or there's somebody walking in front of the lama with incense, right? That's why they're doing that, to clear the air for this higher being to come in, because they're very sensitive to it, right? You become very sensitive to this kind of energy. Some children are very sensitive, have very open channels, and they have big trouble in public schools. We see this again and again. I saw this many, many times with Lama Dawa's mirror divinations. People bringing their young kids in saying, you know, their child is having all these neurological problems, and they don't know what's wrong with them. They don't know what to do about it. And the mirror says it's because of the drip in the schools. Then this child is very sensitive. Some children are born very open with very sensitive channels, and they're very susceptible and very vulnerable to this. It's my personal feeling that a lot of the ADHD that we're seeing is actually a drip problem, because the schools are not getting purified. They don't know how to purify this. And a lot of times the windows are closed. It's all this, ventilation and circulation going round and around. There's not enough sunlight coming in. Sunlight can also purify this. Right? It's why being in a sunnier rooms always feels a little bit better. Okay, so this can make a big problem, and it's very sad. I mean, I saw some really sad cases. I remember one case, I think we were in Chicago, and this, these couple brought in their 10-year-old daughter, and she was in a wheelchair. She was so incapacitated. They couldn't find out what was wrong with her. And all the neurologists and all the doctors, and it was a case of she shouldn't have been in a public school. That's why tulkus, these young children that are recognized as reincarnations, are not playing with the other kids. They keep them kind of insulated because they're so sensitive to this energy. Okay, so this is one example of this phenomena of drip that exists, and explains a lot of why sometimes we feel really yucky when we're in certain places, and why some sensitive people and children get very affected by being in these places, and why some lamas and high beings are also very affected by this. Airports in particular. Traveling with Lama Dawa, very difficult being in the airports, going in the airports and traveling. Sometimes he would have seizures. He was so sensitive to the energy. And you can't really go and burn incense in the airports. So this is an example of drip. That's an outer form of drip. We are producing it, right? But we go into these places and we are affected by it, and it can create a sense of lethargy and dullness. Okay, so it's like it obscures the channels, it obscures the subtle energy, and it obscures our innate wisdom. So one of the reasons why it's such a important practice for practitioners to do it every day is that we need to constantly purify this so that our innate nature, our wisdom awareness shines without obscuration. That's why this is an essential practice. All the great lamas do Riwo Sangsho every day or a song offering every day. They all do it every day. So it's that important. Dujir Rinpoche did it every day. You know, my guru, Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, every morning, I remember 3 o'clock in the morning hearing him up with the drum. He would start the day with Riwo Sangsho. You know, and it was like, wow, if they think it's this important to do, how much more that we should also recognize how important it is. So drip veils the subtle energy channels, obscuring our pristine awareness. And it creates a dullness, a lethargy. Accumulated over time, it can create neurological problems. It can create depression, forgetfulness, all these kinds of problems. And it accumulates over time. So there's also drip that is divided into the different elements. Space drip, fire drip, earth drip. An example of space drip. What would be an example of space drip?
Fireworks.
Wireless.
Wireless.
Oh yeah.
Wireless. EMF radiations. Cell phone towers. Big problem now. Big. It is affecting us. It's a form of drip. It is affecting us. There is, a growing body of people who are, gathering lots of scientific evidence to show how it's affecting living beings. But it's a form of drip. So when you spend a lot of time in front of the computer or around this, it has this cumulative effect. It's not conducive to, our pristine clarity, developing clarity, pristine clarity. It's actually counterproductive. So it's a real difficult conundrum in our modern day to be practitioners, but also be constantly exposed to this. That's a form of a space drip.
What are common effects of that kind of dream?
Brain cancer.
Headaches.
Brain cancer.
Well, brain cancer on a physical level, yeah, the cell phone next to the ear definitely has shown to brain cancer. I was thinking more like in terms of our meditation. The biggest consequence is it makes it very difficult to focus your attention for any length of time. We develop very short attention spans. We can't hold our awareness and our attention, which makes it difficult to meditate. Makes it difficult to have those states of absorption in meditation, because it's always the prana gets disturbed. It shakes the prana, scatters the prana, so it's very difficult to collect that energy, and therefore do things like visualization practices becomes much more difficult, because that's a function of your prana stabilizing. So this always being exposed to this vibration literally scatters the prana. So then it becomes more and more difficult. For myself, because I live in these two worlds, if I'm going to be doing any kind of intensive practice or retreat that involves working with the prana, I have to get off the internet for a set amount of time, or I just can't. And I've talked with my teachers about this. I had a discussion with Shempen Dawa Rinpoche, one of my gurus, about, what do you notice with this? Because these are teachers who also live and know about this technology. And he says, if he's watching TV, he can't do Togel practice. He cannot do these higher sort of Dzogchen practices. It's not possible, because it's too scattering of the energy. There's also, in the subtle body, there's a subtle energy channel connecting the eyes to the heart called a karti, crystal channel. That's very, very important for visualization practice. And the other thing Shempen Dawa Rinpoche said, when you have this artificial light going into your eyes, it's diminishing the power of this karti channel. That's an artificial light, right? Going right into the eye, right into the brain directly, but also has effects with this subtle channel that connects the eye with the heart. So therefore it makes it very difficult to do certain Dzogchen practices, of visionary practices. It's counterproductive, and disrupts the development of that subtle energy channel because of the light, in this case. Not necessarily because of the EMF radiation, but because of the light looking into these devices all the time is really, we're becoming more and more ignorant, literally, as a result of this constant. And you think of the children too, how it's affecting them as well. So that's a kind of a space drip, an example of space drip. So another place that is very heavy with drip are places like slaughterhouses, anywhere where beings are killed.
I-5 in California.
Yeah.
It's all those slaughterhouses for miles and miles.
Yeah.
I can't go there.
Butcher shops.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the tantric tradition, some of the vows we take is we're not allowed to go to butcher shops because they're full of this drip. And this drip is not only because an animal is suffering and being killed, but when the blood is released, the prana is released, and it attracts all these kinds of spirits. So it's and of course in some shamanic traditions, this is why they make animal sacrifices. It's the prana that's released, and then these spirits feed on it, right? So these kind of places, slaughterhouses, even emergency rooms where there's blood, attracts certain kinds of spirits, and it has a kind of drip that's also very, affects us very much if we're near this. There's also objects that can contain drip, like antiques. My Lama Dawa always, I hear lamas laughing all the time at Westerners that want to get antique ritual things. They're shopping on eBay or they go to Nepal and they want to find these old things. And Tibetans won't touch that stuff. They want everything new. And it's because there's energy attached to that. And you don't know where it came from. And you don't know if that was used in the right way. You don't know who handled that. So there is an energy that's going to be attached to that. And unless you know what you're doing and handling that, better not to touch it. And again, I have seen situations where people come to Lama Dawa, they have this problem, this big legal problem, or suddenly this financial problem. They don't understand it, and the divination will say, you bought that old Kongling, didn't you? Have you noticed that ever since you had that in your house, these problems have started? Like, yeah, many times like that. You bring some object into your home and then suddenly your wealth energy is gone. Or suddenly somebody gets sick in your home. Or suddenly you're fighting. Couples that get along really well and now they're fighting. It's because this kind of drip, this contamination, this obscuration has come into the space and is affecting people. Okay? So, antique things. Very careful about antique things. Also, another place where we get drip is wearing other people's clothes, used clothing. Right? It's also a big pastime to go to Goodwill or flea markets and find, clothes on sale, used clothing for sale. But because of this, we're exuding, right, this waste product all the time, it gets in our clothes. Our clothes are going to have that energy, right? And so if we buy used clothes, even though they may be washed in the washing machine, they have this person's energy associated with it. And if you put that on and maybe you don't know anything about that person, it can really affect you, right? So likewise, Tibetans will never wear used clothes. The only exception is if it's clothes from a lama or a high being. Then those clothes have very different quality to them.
Can these sound practices help?
Yeah, you can purify with sound. Yep. Yeah.
What about relatives?
Relatives is a little bit different. Like partners and people that you're close to, because your energy's all mixed. Same thing with like getting an antique from your grandma. That's a family heirloom. That's different. Then you don't want to get rid of that. That has a whole different quality of energy. That has to do with yang. right? So things that are in your family, you're all mixed there, you know. I mean, it's fine. Your younger daughter's going to wear your older daughter's clothes. I mean, it's just going to happen. There's no problem with that. Okay, it's when you buy people you don't know their clothes. You know, I once had, years ago when I was a nun, and of course, you know, people were always giving me clothes. You know, this one lovely man from Montreal gave me this beautiful wool sweater, you know, and it was really nice. And I wore it, and I was like, I mean, I could really feel that there was a, you know, really, it really affected me very much.
Kunzang?
Yeah.
Okay. I spend, my job, 8 hours a day in front of the computer doing
Yeah.
design work and everything.
Yeah.
You know, people without much money go to thrift shops.
Yeah.
You know, it just, how is this not fear generating? These, I recognize that there are these
Yeah.
these obstacles, but it's almost like I'm going to be afraid to go to work, afraid to clothe, because of who knows.
No need to be afraid. Just be aware that it exists, right? Once you're aware that it exists, then you can do things, right? Then you can do things about it. And then maybe you'll understand why certain things happen. But there's, you know, this is our world we live in, right? We can't avoid these, right? It's the world we live in. So we're trying to understand the subtle things going on behind the scenes, right? Because our song offering is addressing that. The reason why we're doing song is it's addressing this subtle dimension of reality, right? And so we have to be aware. We have to understand why we're making all this smoke. You know, why? So the song offering is addressing all these kinds of subtle things that are part of our reality. Are part of our reality. Yeah, I mean, like for example, just a simple example of understanding this idea of the sort of drip that we all exude. Doesn't it feel better when you change the sheets on your bed? Right? Why? How come? You know, it's your energy that your waste product, right? I mean, you wouldn't piss in your bed and then sleep in it, right? So in the same way, we're exuding this. We are. So we should know that, and then we can take care of it and purify that, clean that. There's also certain kinds of food that are said to contain a kind of drip, and these are recognized in both Ayurvedic and Tibetan traditions of food, and things like garlic and onions. I think they call them the tamasic foods or something like that are not conducive to meditation. Right, that make the mind dull, sleepy. Pork is another one among the meats. Pork, garlic, onions are the biggest offenders. You know, so they have innately this kind of this category of drip that has this effect on our subtle energy. Okay, so this idea about drip. So when we go through the text, you're going to see this word come up again and again in the Tibetan, drip, drip, drip. And in one of the texts that I'm giving you, that's the original song that Guru Rinpoche taught in Tibet, it also lists many, many other types of drip and sources of drip. It'd be interesting to read through that text. Okay? Song also purifies the outer elements. Right, the elements: earth, fire, water, air, and space. These are the 5 elements that the world is made of. All things are made of the 5 elements, including our bodies. This is sort of another fundamental principle in these teachings. The outer elements and our bodies. And the outer elements of the world is called the container. And we, sentient beings, are the contents. So this idea of container and contents also comes up again and again in the teachings and in the practices. The container and contents, purifying the container and contents. So container is like the environment, the world, and we living beings are the contents. And we're all made of the same elements. So they will say the elements of the container are the mother elements, and we are the child elements. Okay? So, because there's this direct relationship, when we purify the outer elements, naturally, it's going to have a reciprocal effect of purifying the inner elements. Right? Likewise, when we seek to purify the inner elements, it will also have a reciprocal effect of purifying the outer elements. Right? So there's many practices that we also do to purify the inner elements of the body, recognizing that this also has this reciprocal effect. So song is mostly directed at purifying the outer elements of the environment, which will naturally have this effect of purifying our bodies. And this purification is what causes the healing, right? So song is a healing method. It's often prescribed, and often was prescribed. I gave the history of Shakyamuni's time and Guru Rinpoche's time. The king got sick, and the way to get well was to do a song offering. So the purification is happening because of the purifying the elements, the constituents of the world and the constituents of our bodies. And, from a Tibetan medicine or Ayurvedic medicine point of view, illness happens because of an imbalance of these elements. Right? It starts with an imbalance of the elements, which then produces these categories of symptoms that are divided into the doshas. Right? Maybe you've heard of the 3 doshas, Ayurvedic medicine or Tibetan medicine. The root of that are elemental imbalances. So by purifying the fundamental elemental essences through song offerings, we also can purify the elements of our body. So it is very healing to do these practices. Healing to remove the obscurations, the drip, to purify the drip that may be affecting our health, or elemental imbalances may be affecting our health. So that's another purpose and reason for doing song. So, to me, song is like a wonderful, environmental practice. I often call it an eco-Buddhist practice. Song practice is an eco-Buddhist practice because we're purifying the environment. And this particularly, if you do it in places that have been really disturbed, like forests that have been clear-cut, or places where mining is happening, where the earth has been very disturbed. And also, doesn't it feel yucky to be in those places? There's this disturbance going on, and it doesn't feel comfortable. So doing this kind of practice in these areas that have been disturbed is very purifying and very healing, and helps to restore harmony. It's also done in the Tibetan tradition. They do song before they're going to disturb the earth, before they're going to build something and dig into the earth, or before they're going to cut down trees. This is a kind of a practice that is done as a way to sort of purify the air, but also to make offerings to the spirits there, so they don't become upset about what we're going to do. So it's like paying them something. So song practice is often used for that, preparing an area to be inhabited by humans, or to go to areas that have been very polluted and very damaged, to help to begin the process of restoring harmony there. So it's very healing for the environment, very healing for our bodies, and very healing for the environment. Song is also, because we call it an offering, right? It's called an offering. So it's an act of generosity. It's something we do to give something, to offer something. When we make this effort to collect these ingredients and make the ingredients and prepare the fire and take the time out to do this practice, it's a form of offerings. It's a form of generosity. And in this context, then we think, who are we offering to? Who are we offering this song to? And here's where we have this idea of the 4 guests. Yeah? There's 4 guests. 4 categories of objects of our offering. And this, again, is an idea that comes up again and again in the Buddhist and the Tantric teachings, the idea of the 4 guests. Every time we do ritual practices, whether it's a tsog or an offering, we have the 4 guests that we're offering them to. Yeah, is this a familiar concept? What are the 4 guests? Who are the four guests? Enlightened beings. Yeah, that's the first guest. Then
80,000 kinds of obstacles.
protectors are the second guest. Then you said the 80,000 obstacles. That's the fourth guest.
Right.
So who's the third guest?
All living beings.
All sentient beings. Okay, so that's like a rough way of talking about the four guests. So, I found it very useful to really spend time thinking about the four guests, because actually everything we do, we have this kind of relationship. It's really talking about relationship and dividing categories of beings into these four areas, right? So there's sort of four levels that we're dividing beings and the recipients of our offerings. And it's really important to kind of understand our relationship and where we are in this. It's like a hierarchy. It's talking about a hierarchy. And, it's important to know where we are in this hierarchy. Okay, so there's always this idea, or there should always be this idea, there's a hierarchy above us, higher than us. Right? This idea of something higher than us. And then there's this idea of something equal to us. And then there's this sort of attitude or feeling of those that are below us. We have these kind of feelings in different contexts of our life, that there's some we hold higher than us, some we treat the same as us, and some we kind of dismiss as lower than us. Right? We have these kinds of relationships naturally in our life. Right? Like, for example, let's say somebody very famous was going to come over to dinner to your house. You were told somebody, this very famous, could be the Queen of England, or the Pope or the Dalai Lama is going to come to your house for dinner. What are you going to do? Well, how's that going to make you feel? I better clean my house, right?
Stressed.
I got to clean my house. I got to make dinner, so I'm going to get the best food. Maybe I'll buy new clothes so I look really nice. Right? There's like this sense that there's somebody higher than us. Right? And then we have all this sort of way that we relate to that. Right? It's about relationship. Or if we go to a restaurant and suddenly there's a movie star there. A rock star. How do you feel? There's like this feeling we have. Or how about times when you're sort of like courting someone, you're really attracted to someone and you're sort of like in this stage of courting them. At that time we kind of put them on a pedestal, right? And then we want to look nice, right? We make this effort to sort of impress, right? Because we're sort of, there's this attitude that they're above us. And then those people who are close to us, if we have a good friend or, one of our kids is going to come over for dinner, we're not going to necessarily clean the house. We're not going to necessarily go through all this effort, right? Because we consider them the same as us, right? They're sort of, our attitude and our behavior is like, we treat them the same, it's casual, right? So that's a different level of a guest, right? And then what would be an example of like the fourth guest coming to your house?
The homeless guy coming in to use the piano.
Okay. What about a thief? Somebody coming to steal from you. That's a fourth guest. You don't want that. Right? You have a different feeling about it. You're not going to clean your house for a thief. Right?
Not me.
Like you have this different feeling. I don't want that.
Clean your house.
They're gonna harm me. They're gonna make a problem for me. Right? There's this kind of relationship. That's a fourth guest relationship. Okay, so like even in our human lives, we have this way of hierarchically thinking of others and where we are in that. Okay, so that kind of idea is with this idea of the four guests that we have in our practices and our teachings. And so when we do song, an offering like song, we are inviting the four guests. We have 4 categories of guests that we'll go more into detail with, that we're inviting, and we're making offerings to them. In this case, it's an offering of smoke, right? Why smoke? Why offer smoke? Right? Smoke is a way that we can actually transport, or we can actually transmute something from our material realm into an immaterial realm. Right? It's the vehicle to carry the essence of these offerings into a dimension that they can take it in. Okay, so the smoke, the fire, which we see as a living being, right? The fire is actually the goddess Gokarma, fire goddess. It's transmuting this material thing into a form that these beings in these dimensions can ingest. They can't take it in the forms that we take it in. They live in another dimension. Okay, so this is a way, a skillful way to transform that so that they can take it in. It creates a formless offering. It turns a form offering into a formless offering. And then is carried into space by the smoke, where it finally dissolves into space. Okay, so smoke is the vehicle, very important vehicle. And in this case, the smoke can become anything they want, anything they need. Right? Of course, there are particular things that we burn, and there are particular things we don't burn. Not all smoke is an offering. Different smokes have a different effect. Some smokes repel. Right? Like in some of our practices, we burn Google. That repels. That kind of smoke, they don't like. It repels. So we never burn Google as an incense offering, because we don't want to repel. We want to invite them in. So we're not going to burn things like Google. Also, tobacco repels. So in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we don't use tobacco as an offering. In some other traditions, they do. But in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, they are seen to repel. They're repelling the ones that we want to bring in. So we don't burn things like tobacco. We don't burn meat. Charred flesh repels. Right? So, for example, Tibetans will not eat char-broiled meat. Barbecues, they don't like barbecues because you're burning meat. They don't like coffee because it's a burnt bean. They don't eat burnt stuff, because to them that is a kind of noxious, has noxious effects. It repels. So like you're talking about fireworks, right? Fireworks repels, the smoke from fireworks. Explosives, gunpowder, this repels. So different smokes have different effects. So we're very specific about what we burn, because we want to draw, we want to attract, we want to feed, and we want to invite, and we want to attract. We don't want to repel.